Hey, Shalom, Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, Bashem Rakakwadash, double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwath and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick Lord's Will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I just wanted to read through an article that I came across online. This is on thehub.ca, and it goes into the fertility rates, and the fertility rates pretty much are dropping. So here it says, with a record low of 1.25 children per Canadian woman, stop dismissing falling fertility rates as a choice, right? So one of the things that is a very common theme with all these different, so-called developed nations, with all their so-called wisdom and all that, is that they're all experiencing a sharp decline within their fertility rates. And it really, it's really eye-opening, but at the same time, it really actually makes you even appreciate why the Lord said certain things, in regards to, being fruitful and multiply, and understanding that the Lord's ways are ultimately higher than the ways of this world, right? As a matter of fact, I'll start off with that because there's a certain, especially in the West, there's a certain level of arrogance, in terms of them knowing more than the Most High, right? This is Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8, and it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts," right? So the ways of, especially the rulers of this world, they're of that mindset, or they don't think they actually need the Most High. They don't actually need proper instruction, right? They liken themselves to be as gods, right? So, so I just want to read through this, make a couple points, and Lord's will, as always, this lesson, would be edifying, right? So it says, whenever we speak on our podcast about the falling fertility rate, it says inevitably we hear from viewers that the cause is simple. People are choosing to have fewer kids. It says they point out that the countries all over the world are dealing with this collapse and there is no solution, right? There really is a solution, or, it really is, one is to, if they actually implemented the, when you really go into a lot of these different laws of the scriptures, you understand, like, this is why this was important. You know what I'm saying? It says here, it is nice, tidy explanation that takes away the need for action, and says, if people are choosing to have fewer kids, they must be their preference, and we can't do anything about it, right? So it says the word recession. Okay, I'll read this here. It says young Canadians are living through what he called a milestone recession, as traditional markers of adulthood, such as stable careers, home ownership, family formation, are delayed, if ever reached at all. Right. So now, we're experiencing a time where, certain of these milestones are a lot more difficult, to be hit. You know what I'm saying? So it's a lot harder to actually hit these so-called milestones, right? But that's one of the things that, a lot of people are deciding, not to have them, right? And children really, you know children are really, wonderful, but once, if they can't hit some of these milestones, they feel the need that they think, yo, I can't, especially when it comes to home ownership, because now home ownership seems to be a lot more difficult to actually attain, to actually, have a home in this society, because, things are becoming more increasingly expensive, right? So, I wanted to read this in regards to, children, because, and that's another thing also in this society, right? In this kingdom, you know, women are not taught, you know, the I don't want to say the benefits, but children and motherhood are seen as a bad thing, especially especially amongst our nation. They're programmed to be taught, you know, that it's a bad thing. And then there's this growing trend online I've been noticing where a lot of women are actually they actually start to regret motherhood because of the responsibility that actually comes with it, right? But that's part of the woman's actual creation and nurturing, is to actually to love their love their husbands, right, and actually bring forth children, right? But our women have and that's another thing. A lot of our women, they go to these universities, right, and they've been bamboozled with those serpents philosophies, that different fruit, those ways, those works, those deeds. And now they're actually in a pickle where they want they want to have it all, and they're realizing their biological clock won't allow them to do so, right? So now that a lot of them, they realize they're now too old to have children. It's a lot more difficult to have children. So it's just so much. It's just this society is just really much a complete mess, right? So I want to read this here. This is Psalms chapter 127, verse 3, and it says, "Lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb are his reward. As arrows that are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth." It says, "Happy," verse 5, it says, "Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them, and they shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate," right? So, and that's another thing also. It's also a very shameful thing, especially, as a man, I'm just speaking on from the man's perspective. It's actually very shameful if a man has, a lot of children. He gets shamed for that, ironically, by women, because going back to the serpent philosophies, a lot of them are more likely, especially of our nation, they are more likely to be the one to essentially delete their children, right? So that's one of the things. Like, I was just using the canon, as an example, because I believe he has, it's either 11, I want to say 11, between 11 and 13 children, right? But that should be the norm, because if you have a society like that where the men actually have the access to be able to have, and the resources to be able to have more than one woman, all these women would actually get their children, and that would correct and fix the birth rates. You know what I'm saying? If every man had to actually had the substance of Nick Cannon, for example, just using him as an example because he's a common example. you know he, I don't know how many wives he has, but let's just say he has 7 wives, for example. With his 7 wives, they all had a child, right? So that's what, 7 children in total, right? Now with that mechanism put in place, then you wouldn't have to deal with the problems that you're having in this society as a whole. But yet, for all, you think it's more advantageous for you to push alphabet lifestyle, and these people don't even bring forth children, right? They actually bring forth death, right? That's what the scriptures say: the wages of sin is death, because their lifestyle is not a lifestyle that produces life. The ways of the Lord, and especially have a man having multiple wives and all having their own child, you know is a way of life. It actually brings forth life, and it actually maintains the population, right? As I'm saying that, hold on, let me get an example of that, because the in the ancient times, the mindset that was surrounding children was vastly different to what we're experiencing like right now, right? So I'm gonna read this here, and then I want to go back to the article, right? And this is Genesis chapter 30, verse. I'll start at verse 1, and I'm just gonna down read down a couple verses, right? And it says, and when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, she envied her sister. Excuse me. And she said to Jacob, give me children or lest I die, right? So there was a mindset back then. They had a mindset back then of like, yo, I want to be able to, give my husband children. You know what I'm saying? They didn't have all this fluff that you have in between. For example, she goes off to, she goes off to a prestigious university and all this kind of stuff, and she gets railed on by all these different guys and so on and so forth. Back then the ancient times were vastly different, because like, say for example, you're a father and you wanted to actually have a daughter, right? You would want to, the scriptures say, give your daughter to a man of understanding. So you want to make sure that your daughter was given into the hands of a man, kind of like how King Saul gave his daughter to David after he slayed Goliath, right? To give him to a man of understanding, because King David, he wasn't king at that time as of yet, but like at that point, he was a man of understanding. He was a warrior. He's a musician, a dancer. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's somebody who's capable, right? He's on the come up, right? He wasn't just some regular Pookie and Ray Ray that just got his turn, with you in a college dorm room, and doesn't actually have not just the physical substance, but the spiritual substance to be able to actually take care of that woman, right? So this is verse 2 here, and it says this, and it says, and Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the Most High's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah. All right. So here's going back into the ancient culture too, So she's in a predicament like, okay, damn, I can't actually, give my husband children yet. Right. So so what did she do? She gave her her maid. All right. Her maid is going to be able to actually fulfill that role, for me on my behalf. Right. And this was a very common thing, within the ancient times. It wasn't, the whole monogamy thing, this is just my opinion, right? Personally, I think that the whole monogamy thing is just a way to kind of control the population of Jake, because these other nations know that we get down, right? They know that we multiply, right? That's why they were so fearful of us in the time of Exodus, and they were like, yo, we got to operate with a certain peaceable mindset with these people, right? They don't like it when Jake takes, because Jake dominates, right? When it comes to, being able to give children and being able to give lots of children, right? That's just within our nature to do that. You know what I'm saying? Because, within us, it's just to be naturally, just to be fruitful and multiply. And that's righteous, right? Because if you have a mindset like that, you don't actually run into problems of a declining fertility population. Like, what kind of shit is that? Excuse my French. What kind of shit is that? That doesn't make any sense, right? You can't have a thriving society if, nobody's having children, because who's going to pick up and actually maintain the laborious work that is needed to continue a nation, right? So now your nation is now, if you're thinking it from the perspective of like, okay, you're a king, you don't have people replenishing the population. Now your population is going to be at a standstill. So you're just going to have, it's just going to start dwindling out, because you just have people just growing older, they pass, and then, you don't actually have anybody, filling in those gaps, so to speak, and actually having children, right? So this society just doesn't make any sense when you look at it from the ancient, perspective, right? That's why the scriptures say, to seek the old paths. When you look at it from the ancient way, the righteous way, the way the Lord actually intended us to actually live, you realize that the Lord's ways are truly higher than the ways we were living. Babylonians and feminists and all this type of shit, man. So um I'll read verse 3 again, and it says here, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear her upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah the handmaid to wife. And Jacob went in unto her, so Jacob slept with her, right? And Bilhah conceived a son. And it says, and Rachel said, the Most High Yahweh, Bashem Yahushai, hath judged me, and also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan, right? So this is just pretty much, this chapter here goes into like the birth of the different sons of Jacob, right? So I want to go back to, let me go back to the article and read a little bit more here. So it says, dismissing the very real phenomenon of families having children later in life, or if at all, to have fewer of them is simply being a choice, ignores the structural causes behind those decisions. Are families having fewer children because their preferences have changed or their circumstances have changed, leading them to make fewer different decisions than they otherwise would, right? So, a lot of, well, it honestly could be a bit of both, because, preference wise, you've left it, you kind of left everything, you kind of left this power, into the hands, of women, right? And basically, they don't, this is what they've done with their freedom, so-called freedom. They've just slept around with all these different men, and they don't actually have the proper spiritual resources to be able to vet and pick a decent mate, and then them doing so, sleeping around and this hookup culture and all that, it doesn't actually even bring forth life too, because now she loses her what's it called, she's not looked as favorably as a virgin, so to speak, as a young woman, that hasn't slept with anybody before, right? So it says the cost of something goes up, people choose to use less of it. Take road trips, for example. You might enjoy taking family road trips, vacations, right? So if gas went up $5 per liter, it says it suddenly doesn't seem more affordable, so you probably choose to take fewer of them. And that's one of the reasons why people are not having a lot of children, because if they can't afford a house to actually be able to house those children, what makes you think they're going to have children? That just makes sense, right? So let me hold on. It says the distinction between choices and preferences matters a lot when talking about birth rates. It says a 2023 Carter study found that Canadian women without kids wanted an average of 2.2 and expected to have 1.9. The reality is that they're having fewer than that, with Canada's fertility rate hitting a record low of 1.25 as of 2024, putting in an ultra low category. That includes countries like South Korea and Japan, right? Let's see here. It says one researchers have found for the decrease in fertility rates is the rising prerequisite of parenthood, specifically what would be parents feel the need to be ready for kids. The bar has risen drastically over the past decades, and it correlates with all the costs we've been burdening young people with. So it says a high cost of education, expensive housing costs, and shortage of family-sized rentals. So all these are, reasons why a lot of these people are not having, children. And that's just one, thing you kind of have to worry about, when you actually have children, in a society like this, because, you have to also worry about the kind of content, they get exposed to online, the kind of content they might see on, Netflix programs and all that. You have to worry about, your neighbor being like an Epstein type of character. You know what I'm saying? Like there's just, and I remember years ago there was a, what's it called? There was a parade in New York with all these alphabet people, and all those alphabet people, they were chanting like, coming after your children, like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, so there's a lot you gotta, you worry about. That's why the scriptures say, this is not our rest, because it really would, it surely would, surely destroy us with a sword destruction. You know what I'm saying? This is not a kingdom that can actually, provide us, a comfortable, rest. You know what I'm saying? This is, as a matter of fact, since I said that, where is it? One second. Just bear with me on this. This is Deuteronomy 28, verse 41, and it says, "And thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity." Right? So, we wouldn't be even, we would be in a situation, we're not, fully, able to, enjoy our children like you would in the ancient times, because there's so much. Yeah, this is like I said before. There's so much you have to worry about, in this kingdom. In regards to the welfare of your children, and then on top of that, there's a lot of so-called. I don't want to say so-called, but it's paternity fraud. That's one of the things that you kind of have to worry about, because, these women, they spent a lot of years being loose, and then they're looking for somebody to, take up the responsibility. So now you, as a young man, you have to, consider like, okay, is this woman, a very good mate, to actually bring forth children with, right? And then even on top of that, the children can be a complete, demon like Absalom, right? So there's just so much you have to worry about, when it comes to the mindset of children, in this kingdom. But, if you actually, but this is just to show the importance of the Lord's ways are really above the ways, of this world, because the scriptures talk about how, the wisdom of this world is essentially, it's foolish, and it's true. And we're seeing that in real time, because these are supposed to be, especially like the US and Canada and the UK, and, these nations are supposed to be seen as like the so-called pinnacle of wisdom and all that. But, look at they can't even figure out, man, like, how do I actually reverse this fertility rate so people can actually have more children? You know what I'm saying? So this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, and it says, "And the powers, blessed them, and the powers said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it." And it says, "And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Right? So when you read that word, go into that word God, it says, the word in the Hebrew is Alahayim, which refers to, judges, Yahushua, and the angels. You know what I'm saying? And one of our commands was to be fruitful and multiply, right? And that's not what's happening in this place. You see sharp declines, and then people are wondering and scratching their heads like, how do we fix this? And these are supposed to be top people, so called, right? Anyways, let me see if there's any more on this. Well, there's quite a bit more, but that pretty much makes the point. In regards to, like, children and all that. Let me get this here. One second. It says, this is Isaiah 11:6, and it says, "And the wolf shall also dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child um, shall lead them, and the cow and the bear shall feed their young ones, shall lie together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. I'm sorry." Verse 8, and it says, "And the suckling child shall play with the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand in a cockatrice's den," right? So, this is describing like a situation where children are not worried about, there's no worry about the welfare of the children, even surrounded by all these animals, all these dangerous, animals, because, in the kingdom, it's their children are going to be good. Our children are going to be good, you know, and that's something we hope for, because in this place there's so much worry. You gotta worry about, like I said before, you gotta worry about all these different things when it comes to the having the welfare of children. You know what I'm saying? All the Yeah, but in this situation, like, you don't have to worry about them being around animals. You don't have to worry about locking your doors. You don't have to worry about PDF files, and that's a very common thing that's been coming out. You don't have to worry about all the odious works of these different heathens, because some of the practices of these different heathens is there was a king, actually, even when you go into the book of Kings, you know he offed one of his I think it was his next born son, if I'm not mistaken, in order to win a war, right? So their mindset is not the same mindset towards the Lord when it comes to having children. You know what I'm saying? So it's this is something to hope for, right? Because in this kingdom, it's man, it's the Lord just has to shorten the days, man, because this is really, you're not living to your full potential, right, in this kingdom, right? So I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this lesson was just quick and edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Shai. Until next time, I say Shalom.